It's 2008, I'm 27 years old, and I'm back in England to visit my family after living in China. I've been living abroad for a few years, mainly as a way of avoiding my mental health problems, namely social anxiety. As my mum eased her tiny car into a parking space outside the supermarket, I sat in the passenger seat, frozen stiff with terror. I was a 6-foot man-child, and I was unable to move. I felt like everybody in the car park was looking at me. My mum turned to me and said, "Would you like to come in for anything?" I was almost hurt by a lack of awareness. Even being out in public was too much for me to handle, let alone the idea of walking into a busy supermarket. So I just sat there while she got out of the car, shut the door, and went off to do her shopping. The fact that she was driving a Ford car, which is about the size of a matchbox, and my head was almost touching the roof, made me feel even more conspicuous and ridiculous. So I kind of slunk lower into the seat and tried to hide my face with my coat collar, just hoping that no one I knew from my school days was walking around the car park. After this humiliation, I spent the next couple of weeks more or less housebound with anxiety at my parents' house. Finally, my mum suggested that I go and see a psychiatrist, which one of her friends had recommended. So a few days later, I found myself sitting opposite a very intense psychiatrist with silver hair and stubble and little round John Lennon glasses. He was staring at me very piercingly and asking me what my problem was, and all of this just made me even more uncomfortable. I told him that my main problem was I couldn't even go out of the house. I didn't know how to walk down the street. I felt very unnatural and clunky and didn't even feel like I knew what to do with my arms. He immediately suggested that we would go out there and then and practice walking around the town. The idea of this absolutely horrified me, but I was desperate to overcome my social anxiety, so I agreed to it. And a few minutes later, on a beautiful crisp autumn morning in England, I found myself walking around this busy market town with a psychiatrist 20 feet behind me on the other side of the pavement, shouting instructions at me like, "Lift your head up, look them in the eye. Yep, that's right, shoulders back, swing your arms, nice and natural." This went on for about 20 minutes. All the while, I was pretty much terrified and just praying that I didn't bump into anyone I knew, because I thought that would make a pretty strange spectacle for them to see me walking around town with someone shouting instructions behind me, actually telling me how to walk. Anyway, we finally got back to his consulting room and he asked me how I felt about it, and I told him that I found it terrifying and uncomfortable, but I also found it exciting and liberating. So when he suggested that I come back next week and we do some more exposure, I agreed to it. I turned up the following week full of enthusiasm, thinking, I know what I'm going to do. I've practiced it all in my head. I'd rehearsed all my walking style and my steps, and I thought I could handle it really well. But all of a sudden, he pulled a bit of a trick out of his sleeve. He said he wanted to take me to a supermarket and help me overcome my fear of going into shops. And he decided to take us to the exact supermarket which I had failed to even go into a couple of weeks before. Naturally, the idea of this absolutely filled me with dread, and I tried to plead with him. I said that I probably wasn't ready, I didn't think I could do it, but he assured me that he would be there to help me, he would guide me, and again, the desperation I had to overcome my social anxiety pushed me to agree to go with him. So he jumped in his car and drove off to the Tesco superstore. It had been years since I'd been in England and years since I'd been into a supermarket like this, so I was absolutely terrified. There were people everywhere, and I could already feel a lot of my anxiety symptoms coming on. My heart was pounding, my hands were sweating, I started to get a bit of blurry vision. But we walked up and down the aisles together, and this kind of made it worse. I told him that I was really uncomfortable, I might have to leave. I felt very claustrophobic in the aisles. I didn't like the confined space and having people walking towards me. But he kind of put his hand on my shoulder and steered me off to another area of the store, and we ended up in the toothpaste aisle, which was much quieter and kind of relaxing. I've actually always found the dental hygiene sections of supermarkets quite relaxing because they seem to have nice bright light. There's a kind of sterile antiseptic smell of a bit of mouthwash in the air. I've always felt they have a kind of clinical relaxing vibe, so I felt quite relaxed being in the toothpaste aisle. There was nobody there, so we just started to walk down the toothpaste aisle, and then all of a sudden he said, "Stop there, you stand there, and whatever happens, don't move, just stand there, you're not allowed to move." So I had no idea what he was doing. He had a kind of a grin on his face, which made me think that maybe this guy was actually a complete lunatic and not me. But I followed his instructions. I stood in the toothpaste aisle. There was no one around. He stood opposite me and he just stood there and looked at me, and he had this kind of half grin on his face the whole time. So we just stood there, two grown men in an empty toothpaste aisle in Tesco's, just stood there looking at each other. And at this point, I started to kind of smirk a bit to myself because I could appreciate how bizarre and surreal this would have looked to anybody. Just as I was starting to enjoy our bizarre little escapade, an old lady started to shuffle her way down the toothpaste aisle, and this began to fill me with dread. I started to imagine that she would completely freak out seeing these two grown men just standing there, that she would get very nervous and panic. She might call the store security. I might get thrown out. I might get banned from Tesco's for life. Might end up on the evening news. But I was not allowed to move, so I just stood there, and this old lady just came shuffling down closer and closer and ended up standing right next to me and picking through the racks for something that she needed. After a little bit of looking for whatever it was she wanted, she turned to me and she said, "Oh, I never know what to choose these days. There's just so much of everything." And I made some comment off the top of my head. I was like, "Oh yeah, there's just too much of everything, isn't there, these days?" I just said anything I could, as I was barely able to even keep my composure because I was so nervous. Once she had got her denture cleanser or whatever it was that she was looking at, she just turned to me, said goodbye, and then walked off down the aisle. And this whole experience absolutely blew my mind. First of all, I didn't think that two grown men could just stand opposite each other in a toothpaste aisle in Tesco silently and not get kicked out for acting weird. And then secondly, I never imagined that an old lady or anyone could come along, not think that something weird was going on, that she could just talk to me as if nothing was happening, very happy, and then I would just have a bit of chit chat with her, and then she would just leave and go on about her day. And this whole situation just blew my mind. Now, we continued to stand there for a little bit longer that morning, and we had multiple interactions with people who just came down the toothpaste aisle, did their shopping, exchanged a bit of small talk with me, and just carried on. And this completely exploded my worldview. I just thought that there's no way that they couldn't see me standing there. They couldn't possibly not know that I was racked with social anxiety. They couldn't possibly think that this was something bizarre going on with two guys just standing around, lurking about like weirdos. And it really was a serious epiphany for me, and it rewired something there and then in my brain. It gave me a deep, deep social learning that people don't care. They don't know what's going on. They don't know you're anxious. They just want to have a bit of small talk. They want to talk to people. Their lives are boring. They're open to conversation, and then they just do their thing and they just go off about their day. And it doesn't matter. They don't care what you're doing. Nothing really matters. And this was just a really life-changing revelation for me. The adrenaline rush was huge, and that adrenaline rush stayed with me. I remember driving back to his consulting room. The adrenaline was still pumping through my body. We kind of celebrated when we got back to his room and had a debrief about what had happened. The adrenaline was still with me after my mum came and picked me up from his consulting office and drove me home. And the memory of that was burned into my brain and lives with me today. And it had such a big effect on me that very quickly I was able to overcome my fear of walking around the streets, overcome my fear of going into the supermarket. I began driving again. I overcame my fear of driving into the petrol station at the supermarket and filling up my car. I've been to that Tesco superstore hundreds of times since that day, but not a single time goes by when I don't walk through those automatic doors and feel a rush of excitement and pleasure at how free I am and how much I enjoy going in there now, and how different that is to how I used to feel. It's the same when I fill my car up in the petrol station. It's the same when I do many, many things that used to be such an ordeal and a nightmare for me. I still feel that rush of pleasure at what it's like for me now. And I would really love for you, after watching this video, to also feel that rush of pleasure and feel that freedom of doing the things that you're so scared of. So please, after watching this video, I would really implore you just to take action steps, because we can sit with therapists and we can go over our trauma and talk about stuff for years and years and years. But actually taking action, going out and relearning stuff, facing fears, it has such an immediate impact. It rewires stuff in your brain. You have new epiphanies and new social learning, and it changes things profoundly, and it changes them very quickly. So I really hope after watching this might give you some inspiration to just face your fears head on and reclaim the kind of life that you can have.